Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and I'd like to welcome you to my lecture on Chapter 5 of the Schwalbe book, Project Scope Management. Scope is one of the 10 PMI knowledge areas, and it's certainly one of the big three. You'll recall that in an earlier lecture we talked about um, um, trading off the constraints of scope, time, and cost. Okay, so scope is a really big deal, and so tools and techniques for managing it could have a pretty high payoff. So let's sort of explore scope in a more careful way, so that when we're thinking about it and talking about it, we have a more thoughtful point of view. So scope refers to all the work involved in creating the products of the project and the processes that are used to create them. A deliverable is a product produced as part of a project, such as hardware or software, planning documents, or minutes from a meeting. So I just want to point out that the deliverable is some artifact, something that's created in the project that is either the product or service itself or some intermediate product or service that's going to be used to produce the end product or service. Okay, so it might be a software program, or it might be a design document. So project scope management includes the processes involved in defining and controlling what is or is not included in a project. So, as usual, we're breaking down the knowledge area and trying to identify the processes that are part of the knowledge area, and they include planning scope, collecting requirements, defining scope, creating the WBS, the work breakdown structure, one of the key tools that we're going to talk about within the chapter, validating scope, which is a little different than you might think it actually means, and controlling scope. And how do all those fit into the 5 process groups? Well, a lot of them fit into planning. So plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope, create work breakdown structure or WBS. They're all part of planning. In monitoring and controlling, we have validate scope and control scope. Okay, so they fit into 2 of the 5 process groups and in a pretty well and expected kind of a way. So this is very, as a topic area, this is very planning heavy. Okay? Planning scope management. The project team uses expert judgment in meetings to develop 2 important outputs: the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. The scope management plan is a subsidiary part of the project management plan. So again, this PMI approach is very, it's kind of planning heavy, okay? Certainly the PMI folks believe in planning, and the idea is that each project should have a document, a coordinated document that's a project plan that has some parts that come from each of the knowledge areas, and this is going to be true for scope as well. So, scope management plan contents. How to prepare a detailed project scope statement, how to create a WBS, how to maintain and approve the WBS, how to obtain formal acceptance of the completed project deliverables, how to control requests for changes to the project scope. So I'm going to say something similar here to the things that I say in all the knowledge areas. We need a formal approach to these things. These are things that we're going to do on all of our projects, okay? So it may be we have a standard approach. In fact, we may have a description of the approach that we're going to take to all of these in some kind of a project governance document, something that applies to all of our projects, in which case we can merely point to it or incorporate it by reference. Or perhaps we can look at the scope management plan for a previous project and we can adapt it. So when you look at these parts of the project management plan, I don't want you scared off by the fact that we're looking for some content here, and I don't want you to think that you're going to have to write a treatise for each of the knowledge areas every time you come through. It's easier than that. What's the requirements management plan? Well, according to the PMBOK 5th edition, it describes requirements as conditions or capabilities that must be met by the project or present in the product or service or result to satisfy an agreement or other formally imposed specification. The requirements management plan documents how the project requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed. So this becomes a pretty interesting topic, okay? Because depending upon what kind of methodological approach you believe in, your requirements are going to be documented either more formally or less formally. Certainly the people who believe in the waterfall approach believe that there should be a written down on paper, albeit electronic paper, expression of the requirements. Okay? People who believe in agile software development and agile project management, they believe that there should be a written expression of the requirements, but they think it should be much more brief. So they think it should include things like user stories, which can theoretically fit on an index card. Whereas probably the style of the preferred style for people who are taking a more waterfallish kind of approach would be something like it'd be a use case specification, and that might be 5 pages long or 10 pages long, but it wouldn't fit on the back of an index card. So the Agile people are describing the requirements in a more abbreviated way, and that's because they're going to explore them in a more kind of interactive way as they go through each of their sprints. Okay? Now, however you're going to document them, the question is, how are you going to manage them? Because they are going to change over time. Okay, so the requirements management plan should really address the issue of how open you are to change in the requirements. And most people are saying that they're open to change, given that there's a rationale for it. Okay, a case can be made to make the change now rather than to not change and wait till later. Okay, and then in addition to that, the question is, how many of our documents are we going to maintain over time? Are we going to go back and change every document that's ever come out of the project and revise it and then have everybody approve it? Well, in the agile sort of approach, where we've got a group of user stories that are small enough to be on the back of an index card, well, that's some maintenance over time. Every time we agree to add a user story or change a user story or drop a user story, we might want to document how we're doing that. In a more traditional sort of a waterfall project, we might have a lot of documents. Okay, and are we agreeing to keep them in some kind of a version control and approval system over time? It's a good practice. It's also a big commitment. Well, before we record the requirements, we need to collect them. So for some IT projects, it's helpful to divide requirements development into the categories of elicitation, analysis, specification, and validation. And of course, since we're all agile friendly now, it's important to use an iterative approach to defining the requirements since they're often unclear early in the project. And almost everybody feels, both the waterfall aficionados and the agile ones, everybody feels that you need to write things down and express it, review them with stakeholders, make improvements, review them with stakeholders until you get to some kind of a steady state. So this iterative aspect of it is a pretty universal idea, although the agile people will tell you that they invented it. But they'll tell you that they invented almost anything. Um, they're good, and they'll tell you that they're good. Um, so, what do we have here? On slide 9, um, we have a claim that depending upon the point in the project where you discover uh, a defect in a requirement. A defect in a requirement would be a requirement that you forgot or one that you misunderstood and expressed the wrong way. The sooner you discover it in the development process, the less expensive it is to correct. So if we're in the beginning, design and architecture, it's $100. Implementation, $500. Integration testing, $1,000. Customer beta tests, $1,500. Post-product release, $3,000. And this is from a publication from IBM. And I don't know how well researched this is. This is a common belief amongst knowledgeable software development management people. So it's believed to be true. How much we really have research to prove it is another question. That publication is certainly not from a peer reviewed scholarly journal, but still, this is well accepted wisdom, right? So the idea of this is you need to be open to hearing about potential changes to your current understanding of the requirements. You need to be open to that all along, because if you're resistant, you may just take a change that you're going to accept anyway and put it off long enough that it's pretty expensive to incorporate it into the project. And that's what we're trying to get at here. That this kind of openness to change allows us to experience changes earlier where they have a lesser impact on the project. So, you'll remember that we said that there were there are a number of things that we're going to do in this requirements development process. One of them was collecting the requirements. So what kind of things could we do to collect the requirements in a software project? Really any kind of project, but this is particularly geared towards software projects. Interviewing, focus groups and facilitated workshops, using group creativity and decision-making techniques, questionnaires and surveys, observation, solution prototyping, or benchmarking, which is generating ideas by comparing specific project practices or product characteristics to those of other projects or products inside or outside of the performing organization. We can also use that in order to collect the requirements. So that the first group, before we get to benchmarking, it kind of has this idea that the requirements are going to be known to people known to us. Okay? We're going to interview them or have a focus group with them, or we're going to have questionnaires or observe them or have some prototyping fun with them. Benchmarking has this idea that we're going to look elsewhere. It's part of this best practices point of view, where we're going to look around the world and say, well, what do other people do? Okay, let's not reinvent the wheel. If there are things that other organizations do who we compete with or in the same profession or industry, let's get ideas from there. So here are some statistics on requirements for software projects that came from a 2011 survey by Simpson called in the paper 2011, The State of Requirements Management. So 88% of the software projects involved enhancing existing products instead of creating new products. This is interesting because we are in a much more mature phase of software product development than we've ever been, obviously. It keeps maturing. And the number of times that we have a completely new product or service is getting rarer and rarer. And the fact is, it's more likely that we are coming out with the next release or version of some product that's already there. And so that's going to affect the methods for collecting the requirements and the methods for managing them. 86% of respondents said that customer satisfaction was the most important metric for measuring the success of development projects. Well, I warned you about that in the chapter on stakeholder management. And 83% of software development teams still use Microsoft Office applications such as Word and Excel as their main tools to communicate the requirements. So for the most part, people are using traditional electronic paper tools to capture the requirements and to get them down so that they can get agreement from the parties that they've expressed them appropriately. Okay, so a really cool idea is this idea of a requirements traceability matrix. And this is a part of this whole requirements management point of view. Okay? So, first of all, to really appreciate this, you have to appreciate, you have to ask yourself the question, how big is the product that you are managing the requirements for? Is it a very small software product that's completely new? Is it a very large software product that's completely new? Or is it a software product that is large, but we're coming up with the next release of, etc.? Okay, so you get that kind of dimension. The other dimension is, what kind of methodological approach are you taking to software development? Are you taking a traditional waterfall kind of approach where you're doing a lot of planning and you're getting a lot of the requirements down on paper, electronic paper, but paper? You're getting to people to sign off, and only when they're all signed off do you start to create software? Or are you taking more of an agile approach where the requirements that you're getting down are pretty brief? There are these user stories that they use in the agile method, and you get them down and then you go off and you start to explore them kind of sprint by sprint. Okay, so depending upon the situation that you're in, the expression of the requirements could be, let's talk about the pages of text, right? So for a small agile project, it could be maybe 20 pages of text. For a large waterfall project, it could be 2,000 pages of text. Okay, so we could have much more text to manage. And when I say text, I mean text, diagrams, graphics, the whole thing. So then you have to ask yourself what kind of approach you're going to take to making sure that you've got consistency amongst the requirements. Again, if you've got a pretty small system, I don't care what kind of approach that you're taking, it's pretty easy to hear about a potential change and to think about the requirements and say, well, here's what I think the impact will be. Okay? On the other hand, if you've got a very big system, you may hear about a potential change, and it may be very hard to figure out what the impact will be. Enter the scene with requirements traceability matrix. So what we do is that we take the whole corpus of specifications and expression of the requirements, and we distill them into either a simple table, or we put them into an application. IBM has a couple of applications for their customers. There's one called Requisite Pro, in which you take your requirements and you put the details of them into their application. But at a minimum, what you do is you create some kind of a spreadsheet table, and you start to list the requirements, what the names are, what the category is, what the source is, what the status is. Some of these systems are so sophisticated that they track requirements all the way to the software code. So they'll say this requirement is implemented in a certain Java class, or perhaps in certain methods within the Java class. Well, how does this kind of record keeping help? Well, it helps you in the following way. In a bigger project, we often have diverse stakeholders with competing needs. Okay, so we work through and we come up with a set of features that are sort of implicit in our expression of the requirements, and then one group of stakeholders shows up and says, we need to change this because our needs have changed. So instead of doing it in such and such a way, we want to do it in another way. Now, it turns out if they're the only stakeholder that depends on that code, then that's fine. But what if that code supports other requirements that compete with it, and when we change the code, we're going to break some of the requirements? How can we keep track of all that information? Well, in a very small system, you can keep a track of it in the analyst's head. In a very large system, people are tracking these with these requirements management applications, of which the smallest manifestation is this requirements traceability matrix. And so the idea here is that, one, we don't want any requirements to fall through the cracks. So if we have a lot of requirements for the system, we want to make sure that we remembered all of them when we created the code. And then later, when we're maintaining the code or we're coming out with the new version, then we want to make sure that we don't make rash decisions with regard to changes and improve life for one of our stakeholders only at the expense of others. Okay? And this is all even more useful if you have some kind of a complex product that's going to have release after release after release, because you're probably going to want to know what the requirements for the product were in release 1.2. You're probably going to want to know what you think the requirements are in release 1.3 or 2.0. And some of these applications that track requirements not only are tracking them in an absolute sense, but how they relate to the various releases of the product. So this whole requirements analysis and this whole discipline of managing the development of and the changes to the requirements, especially for big companies who have big software products and a number of successive releases, this has become a very important area. Okay, now, how do we define the scope? Well, there are some traditional ways that we do it, okay? PMI has always said that the best way is to have some kind of a narrative statement of the scope, and they call that a project scope statement. So it could include at least a project scope description, product user acceptance criteria, detailed information on all project deliverables. It's also helpful to document the other scope-related information, such as the project boundaries, constraints, and assumptions. This project scope statement should also reference supporting documents, such as product specifications. As time progresses, the scope of a project should become more clear and specific. And this last bullet on the slide has to do with a concept that we call progressive elaboration. So we have this idea that our expression of the scope of the project gets more detailed over time. Okay, so the first time you see an expression of the scope is probably going to be in the charter, and it's going to be pretty broadly worded. Then you're going to see it in at least the first version of a project scope statement, and that's going to be a little more detailed. The next time out, it should be even more detailed, more specific. Okay, so that's so we call that progressive elaboration. So here on 14, you see you see that we have a project charter, okay, and we have project objectives and project success criteria and approach. It's all pretty brief. And then we go from there to maybe the first version of the project scope statement, which is on the slide here, is version 1, and then maybe version 2. So we should think that things get more specific every time we express the scope. A lot of projects get into trouble in how they manage the requirements process. Okay? We're making the claim here that inaccurate requirements gathering continues to be one of the main causes of project failure. For every dollar spent on projects, 5.1% is wasted due to poor requirements management. Apparently, that came from a study. Organizations need to develop people, processes, and culture to improve requirements management. And this is an important claim because there's a lot of pressure early on a project to go, 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 go. Build, 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 build. Okay? I don't see on a programming project, historically you hear it say, I hear a lot of people talking, I don't see anybody programming. Okay? Well, if they're programming the wrong thing, well, maybe that's not good. Okay? So, some organizations get rushed through the gathering of the requirements. They don't do it in a thoughtful way, and then they pay later. Now, a really detailed way to express the requirements after something like a scope statement is to develop what we call a work breakdown structure. So WBS is a deliverable-oriented grouping of the work involved in a project that defines the total scope of the project. Now, I just want to show you a look. It's organized as a hierarchy. So those of us in information science who know about taxonomies have a real kind of leg up on kind of understanding what we're trying to do. We're trying to take all the work in a project and classify it according to some useful scheme. Okay? So here's one. Here's another expression of one on slide number 19. Here's another version of one that's been put into a Microsoft project on slide number 20. And even more on 21. And another expression of one on 22. Okay, so let's go back and now that we've seen some, let's go back and talk about their properties. A WBS is a foundation document that provides the basis for planning and managing project schedules, costs, resources, and changes. We use decomposition to subdivide a project deliverables into smaller pieces. Now, we've heard deliverable-oriented and project deliverables, at least according to the people who are the leading thinkers in this area. They would like us to organize our hierarchy according to the project deliverables. Okay, and you have to remember the deliverables are the parts of the product or service that we are producing in the project, or they are some intermediate work products that facilitate the eventual production of the product or service. Okay, now why do they want us to organize it according to that? Well, because they don't want us wasting time on things that don't lead to required outcomes. Okay, they historically you give a job to people and say, well, we ought to get somebody working on this, or we ought to get somebody working on that. Well, then the question is, well, what does that lead to? Do we really have to do that? So what they really want to do is they want to focus the breakdown of the work from the things that we have to deliver. So then we won't be including things that aren't really required. Okay? Now, down towards the bottom of the hierarchy, we have this, we're at the bottom, we have this thing called a work package. It's a task at the lowest level of the WBS. So it's the most atomic thing in a WBS. Okay? The scope baseline includes the improved project scope statement and its associated WBS and WBS Dictionary. So I'll talk about the dictionary in a minute. So let's see. Look at the one on slide 18. Website design, homepage design, marketing pages, sales pages. Those are all things we have to deliver. Okay, so that's deliverable based. Okay. Let's look on slide number 19. Concept, website design, website development, rollout, support. These are phases of the project, okay? And this is, in a way, a chronology of the project. Now, a lot of project managers want a WBS to be chronologically organized because they'd like to use it in order to keep track of where they are within the schedule. Okay, so you'll see people who have a level at the top that's the chronology or phase based, and then immediately underneath are deliverables associated with that phase. And most people feel that this is, whereas it's not deliverable based at the very top, it's more chronology based at the very top. Most people feel that if we get deliverable based immediately under the layer that's chronology based, that's adequate. And that's what they've done here on slide number 19. On slide number 20, we have taken that WBS from slide number 19, and we have put it into a project planning tool, in this case, Microsoft Project. We've also put some, we've taken the work packages, which are now the tasks in Microsoft Project. We've given them some time frames, and so we're already seeing a schedule over on the right-hand side. Now, this is additional information. So the WBS is on the left-hand side. The WBS is the hierarchy. It's the taxonomy of work. The schedule on the right-hand side is a further step. Okay, and here's the case on slide number 21 where they decided to organize the WBS by the project process groups, and in a way that's a way to do maybe a chronology. Most of the project process groups are chronological except for monitoring and controlling, which tends to run over top of everything. And pretty much that's what you see happening in the schedule that they developed here. But again, the WBS is the hierarchy, the taxonomy. It's not the schedule. The schedule is more information having been added to that WBS information. And this is just another expression of the same information that we've already seen. Okay, so how do you develop a WBS? Okay. Some organizations, like the U.S. Department of Defense, provide some guidelines for preparing their WBSs. And generally speaking, these are the kinds of approaches that you can take. We have the analogy approach, the top-down approach, the bottom-up approach, and the mind mapping approach. So in the analogy approach, we look for similar projects that have already happened, historical projects, or maybe even projects that are partially complete, and we look for projects like ours, and we say, okay, let's look at the WBS of their project. The top-down approach, we start with the largest items in the project and we break them down. So we build the WBS from the top down. We just get a group of people typically and we brainstorm on it top down. The bottom up approach, well, sort of the opposite. We have a bunch of people and we say, well, if we did a project like that, what would your group have to do on this? What would your group have to do on this? And so we would get from them a list of all the tasks, and then we try to fill in the hierarchy from the bottom up. The mind mapping approach is one that I like because I like these mind mapping tools. It's a technique that uses branches rating out from a core idea to structure thoughts and ideas. Now, I'm just going to point out that mind maps sort of describe a network of nodes, and that if you take a network of nodes and you build it the right way, all you have to do is grab the original node and it becomes the top of a hierarchy. So there isn't a real big difference between a mind map and a hierarchy chart, apart from the style in which you draw it. So here on slide 24 it is an example of a mind map that's being used to create a WBS. Apparently we're using Matchware's Mind View 4 Business Edition. And there are all kinds of tools to do this. There are sort of educationally oriented tools like Inspiration. There are some kind of management oriented tools like Mind Manager. There's a free tool called MindJet. Is it MindJet? No, sorry, FreeMind. Okay. And essentially they allow you to build things that look like the diagram that we see here. Okay? And these are particularly good when you're working with a group of people and you're trying to build the WBS. Okay? You can change around the graph pretty easily. Quite a few of these tools will redraw the diagram for you, so if you add something in and it's getting kind of ugly, it'll tidy it up. So a pretty useful tool. Here are on slide 25 Gantt charts with the WBS generated from a mind map. So these are Gantt charts in a sense, but when you look over on the schedule part to the right, you don't see any bars to indicate when things are scheduled. So this kind of looks like we've got one from MindView 4.0 and one from Project 2010. But what you're seeing is a way to get these things into a classical kind of a Gantt chart oriented kind of structure. And most people are in their project management tools are listing out the work using a WBS, which gives a hierarchical a breakdown of all the work. Now, a WBS dictionary. This is This is an idea that PMI has been selling for a long time. And here's the pitch. Many of the tasks in the WBS are vague and must be explained more so people know what to do and can estimate how long it will take and what it will cost to do the work. A WBS dictionary is a document that describes detailed information about each WBS item. Now, I've got to tell you that for the most part, I've been managing smaller projects, and I've had plenty of WBSs, but I've never had a WBS dictionary personally. Now, I've seen WBS dictionaries on larger projects, and probably if you hired me to be the PM of some kind of a project that was going to send something to Mars, because of the size of the project, and because the stakeholders would be so varied in their understanding of the project, I would think this would be an ideal use for a WBS dictionary. So the PMI party line is you always need one. My recommendation is that you probably don't need one on the simplest of projects with a small stakeholder group who are accustomed to doing this kind of work. But the bigger the project gets, the less accustomed with the work the stakeholders get, and then the more diverse the stakeholder group gets, the more I think it's worth the time to create a WBS dictionary at the same time that you create the WBS. And here's a sample entry. No lack of prose. Okay. I'll leave that for you to read. That's from the text. Advice for creating a dictionary. A unit of work should appear at only one place in the WBS. Okay, so we know, being information scientists, that if we're going to have some kind of a hierarchical classification scheme, right, we probably would want we'd want the items to appear in one place or the other. This is almost like a physical library where you only want to put the physical item in one spot. You may want to have kind of other paths to discovering it, but you only want to put it in one spot. The content of a WBS item is the sum of the WBS items below it. So there is a summing up as we go up the hierarchy. A WBS item is the responsibility of one individual, even though many people may be working on it. This is a guideline that would lead towards perhaps greater accountability. And the WBS must be consistent with the way in which work is actually going to be performed. It should serve the project team first and other purposes only if practical. This is the reason that most of us will accept a WBS in which the second level in the diagram is more chronological, and only under that we get more deliverable based. That seems to make the WBS more manageable for reporting ongoing progress and status, and so we accept that. Project team members should be involved in the development of the WBS. So the more that we have the people who do the work be involved in planning the work, we feel that should they be qualified, we're going to get a better plan, and also we're going to get more buy-in to meet the plan. Each WBS item must be documented in the dictionary. I've already been through that. I personally take less of a hard line on that. It's more situational to me. The WBS must be a flexible tool to accommodate inevitable changes while properly maintaining control over the work content. in the project according to the scope statement. So, important point here is that the WBS has to be able to express changes. So, as we encounter change and as our scope changes, we're going to need to do we're going to need to amend the WBS to reflect our new understanding of the project. So, what went wrong? A project scope that is too broad and grandiose can cause severe problems. So we've got a couple of examples here of things that got out of control. Scope creep and overemphasis on technology for technology's sake resulted in the bankruptcy of a large pharmaceutical firm, Texas-based Fox Meyer Drug. Okay, bankruptcy of the firm. Wow. Okay, that got out of control. In 2001, McDonald's initiated a project to create an intranet that would connect its headquarters with all the restaurants to provide detailed operational information in real time. After spending $170 million on consultants and initial implementation planning, they realized the project was too much to handle and terminated it. Okay, so I'm going to call that a success. uh, because to a certain extent, they could have spent a lot more. Okay, but you really have to get a handle on scope, right? You always have to be able to turn around and say, okay, we're having a conversation about the potential scope of the project, but how does it relate to a reasonable budget? Okay, people are going to want to talk about things and ask for things that are not even remotely possible given the amount of money that's being considered for the project. So everything, and when I say money, I mean money, time. So as we go to collect the requirements, as we go to determine the scope, we always have to have some kind of a big picture test such that if somebody comes to us with a great idea that doesn't fit in the current concept of the project, then we're entitled to say that. We're entitled to say, gosh, this is a great idea. And in a project where we had twice as much time and 4 times the money, we could maybe handle this. But if you're going to sell this idea, you're probably going to have to sell it to so and so up the chain because the rules of engagement they have us operating under won't accommodate your idea, which I think is a great idea, but it's just not going to be part of this project. So you always have to have an eye on, does this fit into the current context? Now we may change the context. Maybe everybody could be convinced to make this a bigger project, but a lot of this scope creeps happens while people are not keeping their eye on the overall goal as they're adjusting what's going to be in, what's going to be out. There are a lot of good ideas, and you can pave your way to project failure by only considering whether the idea is good or not, and not considering whether it fits in your current schedule and budget parameters. Oh, sorry. Was a little bit unresponsive and I went too far. Okay, validating scope. You would think that validating scope would mean one thing, but it means something else. This is a PMI term, and you would think it would mean this. You would think it would mean we come up with an expression of the scope, and then we go and check and make sure we got it right. Nope, it's not what it means. We come up with a statement of the scope, then when we produce the product, we go back and check it against the scope to make sure that we produced what we intended to produce. So this is an inspection. This is a checking off of the actual products against the intended products that were expressed in the scope. Okay? So this is what they call validating scope. I don't think it's the best term, but that's what they call it. Okay, so scope validation involves the formal acceptance of the completed project deliverables. Acceptance is often achieved by customer inspection and then sign off on key deliverables. So even if you think that this is a term that was not well chosen, this is a term of art in the profession. Global issues. Many countries have difficulty controlling the scope of large projects, especially those that involve advanced technologies and a lot of users. For example, the state government of Victoria, Australia, has a website for its public transportation smart card. There are many problems in developing and implementing the smart card. So, and we've got a little more detail on that in the text. So this kind of scope getting out of control can happen to anybody. I can tell you firsthand it's happened to me. And it's hard to find a person who's been around systems projects very long that hasn't had it happen to them. You can get the same kind of stories in other walks of life. You can get people who were building a house and all of a sudden it's over budget. In fact, the people who worked with my favorite architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, the stories of how they ran over the budget are legion, right? So great thinkers, great designers can lead you into big overruns. Okay, so it's all over, and I think that's so it can happen to you. Beware. Controlling the scope. Scope control involves controlling changes to the project scope. The goals of scope control are influence the factors that cause scope changes, assure changes are processed according to procedures developed as part of integrated change control, and manage the changes when they occur. Okay, so change control is a big issue. So it really, again, how you're going to handle change control is going to be probably different if you're doing it on a waterfall kind of a project or you're doing it on an agile kind of a project. In an agile kind of a project, we have this idea that at any given time, we have the requirements that we have, and if people want to restate them, that's fine, as long as we get the business owner to agree that they should be restated. But that the overall scope is going to be defined by how many of the requirements fit into the project. And we're going to discover that as we go from sprint to sprint to sprint. Whereas in contrast, the waterfall approach, there's always this kind of fiction, I'll call it, or proposition is probably a less cynical word for it. There's always the proposition that we know what's going to fit into the project. So we have an expression of the scope. We have full intention to get everything in the project. So every time we express the scope and a plan to go with it, we have this idea that it's all going to fit. Whereas the agile people, not so much. Their only claim is that, well, we're going to get enough of this done that people are going to be happy at the end of the project. So, particularly in a waterfall kind of a project, you have to make sure that every time you have a change to the scope, that you formally consider it, that you make a wise decision, If it's going to impact the schedule or the budget, you ask for a change to the schedule or the budget, because you do have this proposition, and some would call it fiction, that we actually know what's going to fit into the project. Okay, so we've got to be more careful as we go along. Um, Otherwise, we're going to experience some kind of a variance, which is going to be the difference between the planned and the actual performance. A lot of people say that we'll get better requirements from stakeholders if we increase their participation. So we improve their user input. So how could we do that? Well, we could develop a good project selection process. Okay. So that means we're only going to pick winners that they really care about. We're not going to be working on dogs. We have users on the project team in important roles. Well, certainly in the Agile approach, this person who's going to be the product owner qualifies for that. Have regular meetings with defined agendas and have users sign off on key deliverables. Deliver something to users and sponsors on a regular basis. Now, this is something where the Agile people really have their act together. They consider the work that comes out of each of their sprints a deliverable of sorts. Okay? It's not one, they talk about it being a shippable product, and they demonstrate it at the end of every sprint. They want to make the progress visible to the stakeholders. Don't promise to deliver when you know you can't. Co-locate users with developers. This co-location idea is pretty popular stuff with everybody, but again, this whole co-location idea is a pretty big part of the principles preached by the Agile software development people. And again, they would have you believe that they invented the co-location idea, but I'm going to tell you that it was around before they were. Suggestions for reducing incomplete and changing requirements. Okay, now, again, remember that cost curve. The later that we get requirements, either a change to a requirement or requirement that we missed because they were incomplete, the more it's going to cost. So we want ways to be on the front of and not the back end of that rapidly increasing cost curve. Develop and follow a formal requirements management process. Use techniques such as prototyping, use case modeling, and JAD, IBM's joint application development, to get more user involvement. Put requirements in writing and keep them current. Create a requirements management database for documenting and controlling the requirements. And I talked about how that, especially for organizations that have big software products, this having a formal approach and an application to support requirements management is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for them. Provide adequate testing and conduct testing throughout the project lifecycle. This is something that, again, the Agile people like. They are creating fewer specifications and they're starting the code earlier. They're throwing off test results earlier, so they have more to show to people earlier. So in theory, that's a good thing. Review changes from a systems perspective. Again, if you have a large and diverse group of users, you can't just agree to every change because some changes that satisfy one group break the system for groups that share those features. Emphasize completion dates to help focus on what's most important. This is, again, something that works, I think, particularly well in the Agile approach. They have time boxed the whole project. And so every time they come to a sprint, they say, what's the most important stuff that we have? At least in theory, when you get to the end of your time and your budget, at least you can tell yourself that you worked on what you considered at the time to be the most important things. Allocate resources specifically for handling change requests, enhancements like Northwest Airlines did with ResNet. This is, I think, a good practice. And one I want to tell you a short story about. Years ago, I was part of got the wrong thing in the window here. There we go. Years ago, I was part of a project, the order management system. And it was a long time ago, so 35 years ago. And the practices that we followed on the project, but certainly were not all my idea, and maybe most of them were not my idea, but they were very good practices. And this is really the first time that we had this idea of having a budget for change control. And we had a budget in two respects. One is we took the total dollars and time for the project and said, we're going to expect a certain amount of changes to come along. And so we've reserved a certain amount of money and a certain amount of time to accommodate those. Okay, and then every time we approved a change, we would pay for them out of that budget. But the other thing is we even had a budget for the time it took to consider changes. And we had a two-stage kind of process where somebody would propose a change, and then we, in our weekly project management meeting, we would decide if the team was going to go ahead and consider and plan for the change. In that we didn't decide that we were going to do it or not, but we decided that we were going to expend the time that it took to do the analysis and the planning to come back and say, here's the impact of this change and here's how we would do it. So there were some proposed changes the first time that we went through that we would say, no, we're not going to do these. I mean, they're a bad idea because of X, Y, and Z. There were some we said, well, we might do these someday, but we're not going to consider them now. They're not urgent enough. So they're going to go in a pile to be considered later, after this project. And then we're going to have, and then if we got through those two tests, then we'd say, oh, okay, let's do the analysis, let's do the planning, and let's talk about it in a week or two. And in a week or two, it would come back and we would say, okay, it looks like the impact is going to be this. Do we still want to do it? And of course, we could decide to incorporate it in the project plan, or we could decide to to boot it forever or to put it on the pile for the next project. And what was really nice was that people saw that even analyzing these things had a cost, and that the project had to pay for that. And it was just really, really, the dynamics were really, really healthy. And of course, I adapted that as a standard approach for our consulting group, not because I invented the idea, but because I experienced it. And I highly recommend it to all of you. we're getting to the end, using software to assist. So word processing software helps to create several scope-related documents. Most organizations are using some kind of word processing tools to create and manage their scope document. Spreadsheets help to perform financial analysis and do things like requirements, matrices, those kinds of things. Communication software help people communicate. Project management software helps in creating a WBS and then eventually turning that into a plan with a Gantt chart. Specialized software is available to assist in project scope management. In particular, there are these requirements management systems that are becoming increasingly important to organizations that have big applications with a lot of requirements and ongoing change, sort of release after release after release. More and more of these people are turning to these requirements management applications that take all this stuff and manage it with a professional grade information system. And that is the end of scope management. So I'm going to say goodbye until next time. Bye-bye.